you're a gardener. What's happening in your garden this autumn?
Well, I've got to be honest and say, not that much, because in a previous video you asked me about home renovations and they're taking up a lot of time.
I did.
But rather wonderfully, I want to share this. I planted some so-called autumn raspberries a while back, and they have been producing raspberries since late January. And even now, there are still a few raspberries. We're past our peak, but it's a rather special treasure in autumn to have some raspberries.
Oh, you must invite me around for a treat of cream and raspberries. Sounds delightful. I understand last weekend you were at a special celebration in the North Island. Tell us about that.
Yes, the bishops and their spouses were invited to be part of the Henry and William Williams family reunion, celebrating 200 years since Henry and Marianne Williams and their family arrived in Paihia in 1823 to begin missionary service. A few years later, William and Jane Williams arrived, 1826.
Oh, wow. And why are they such a significant family in both Tikanga Maori world, but also the Christian world in this country?
I think in the end that they're really significant because of leadership they provided in the mission work, initially in the Bay of Islands, and then later William and Jane Williams shifted to the East Coast. What did their leadership bring? It brought some advancing for the gospel. Not too long after they arrived and got established and learnt the language, the first Maori were baptised, new mission stations were established. Yes, the gospel was preached in 1814, but it was really hard work for those very first missionaries. And something kind of took off once the Williamses arrived.
Right.
Then, of course, Henry Williams and his son Edward were involved in the translation of the English text of Te Tiriti or Waitangi into Maori, into the Te Reo of the chiefs. And that was particularly important because it was the Te Reo version that was taken around with the chiefs through the rest of the North Island, eventually down into Te Waipunamu, South Island for signing. So a very significant role in the treaty, which today is at the cornerstone of our nation's life.
And he had that role presumably because he was a very accomplished Te Reo speaker himself. Is that correct?
Henry was an accomplished Te Reo speaker, but his brother William was even more accomplished. So, and Edward, his son, who helped with the translation, of course, had basically grown up from infancy speaking Te Reo.
Right.
Very fluent.
So they were very well placed to translate. What other translation work did they accomplish in their lifetime?
Well, William Williams particularly was at the forefront of translating the prayer book, the Bible, and also developed, and with other generations of his family, successive editions of the first dictionary of Maori.
Wow, that's amazing. Because I presume that led to literacy among Maori people, among other things.
Absolutely, establishing and developing literacy, but really the significant achievement here was the preservation of Te Reo.
So are you implying that it could have gone either way at that point?
Well, there were plenty of speakers of Te Reo in those days. It wasn't in danger of being lost at that point in time.
Yes.
But ultimately, when we think of how the whole of the 19th and early 20th century worked out, and it's another story maybe for another video, but the decline eventually of Te Reo because of certain attitudes, forcing young Maori not to speak Te Reo at school and so forth, the preservation of Te Reo has been helped in the long term by it being a written down language as well as a spoken language.
So that's a very significant contribution by the Williamses. What about relationships between, say, for example, the settlers and the Maori tribes? Was there some significant role that they played at that point?
Well, the Williams family, I think, first of all, had a contribution between the tribes. Sometimes there was conflict, and Henry in particular forged a reputation as a peacemaker.
Okay.
And he was a very significant figure in bringing about peace where there was conflict. Henry and William Williamses and their families were particularly important, and this was brought home at the weekend in Paihia, in basically sticking up for Maori in the face of encroachment by the settlers.
Right.
And indeed, the treaty, of course, was an initial means to forge a pathway forward for the incoming settlers and the already established Maori iwi and hapu and whānau. And in my view, Henry Williams was part of standing up for the rights of Maori in the context of developments in 1840 and thereabouts.
Okay. Another thing that strikes me is the relationship between the Williams family and indeed the other missionaries, the CMS group, and the George Augustus Selwyn, the first and only Archbishop of New Zealand, who arrived in 1841, I believe. What was the relationship between these two groups?
It was pretty difficult at times, and George Selwyn really arrived to forge a church for the settlers. I'm not saying there was no mission mindedness on his part, there was, but he was at the forefront of developing the church for the settlers, the Church of England in New Zealand. Whereas Henry and William Williams and other Anglican missionaries and Wesleyan missionaries were here to establish a church among Maori for Maori.
Right.
And there were some tensions, which are subject of quite long, extensive historical discussions, but it wasn't an easy relationship.
I can understand that. Well, just by way of conclusion, what are your thoughts on the current status of our three tikanga church, especially here in our own Christchurch diocese?
Well, it'd be a brave man to say this is the state of really a complicated relationship, because so many people and so many different parts of each of our churches are involved in this relationship. But the thing which, again, I think the weekend in Paihia reinforced for me is that everything does work from relationships.
Sure.
Yes, we've got a written down constitution, and we've got canons, and we've got rules and processes for guiding how we make decisions in General Synod and that kind of thing, and they're really helpful. They help us to make fair and just decisions. But what the Williamses did was to relate to people, to relate as newcomers to these shores to the existing Maori, to those who became Christians and to those who didn't become Christians. And in our diocese, as we seek to relate to the Maori of Te Waiponamu, the Anglican Church here on the South Island,
Yes.
What's vital is the quality of our relationships. And I believe that we've got good relationships, and that's because we keep working on them. And I want to pay tribute to the leadership of Bishop Richard Wallace in this area, and acknowledge many people across our diocese. It's not all about the bishop in this case, who are working well in bicultural ways across our diocese. Thank you to them.
Indeed. I had the privilege of meeting Reverend Wendy in Waimate just last Sunday, and she's a tremendous person of goodwill. She was here worshipping with their Paihia brothers and sisters in Christ, and it was a real delight to meet her, recently ordained.
Absolutely, and ordained in St Augustine's Church itself, but for particular focus on marae in South Canterbury and the mission work on those marae. A really good sign of our bicultural partnership.